Hello everyone, my name is Yoonjung Choi. I'm a product manager working on Azure MCP in Visual Studio. And today I'll be talking to you about Agentic DevOps focused on enhancing .NET web apps with Azure MCP. All right, let's get started. So for today's agenda, we're going to go over an intro. I'm going to talk to you briefly about what Azure MCP is, as well as what MCP is. And we're going to dive into our demos on building and deploying a .NET application and add a SQL and storage using IAC. And then at the end, I'm going to share you some resources. All right, let's start off by going over what Model Context Protocol, aka MCP, is. I think Matt did a great job of summarizing and explaining it right before the handoff, but let me just reiterate some of the key points. So MCP is a relatively new protocol. It's been around for just over a year still, and it was originally created by Anthropic and is now being developed in collaboration with multiple industry partners. I would say the goal of MCP is to provide a standard mechanism for AI models to access tools and resources and to extend their knowledge and capabilities to enable new and more powerful agentic applications. So let's see, MCP is actually being very widely adopted in the industry, including OpenAI, Google is using it, Amazon, Hugging Face, and many others, and Microsoft is not an exception. At Microsoft, we have built MCP support into our IDEs like Visual Studio and VS Code, and have developed multiple MCP servers to plug into these systems, such as Azure MCP Server, which we'll be talking about today. And let's go over some of the key abstractions of an MCP server. MCP server really, you can think about these three things: host, client, and server. So host, this is the LLM, AI application. Client, it serves as a connector between your host and the server. And then the server is the one that provides the context and capabilities to help extend the knowledge of your LLM and AI application. All right, moving on to the next slide. There are a few guiding principles within MCP servers. To list a few, there's like user consent and control, there's data privacy, there's tool safety, and there's also LLM sampling. But today I'm just gonna direct your attention to the user consent and control aspect of it. So users must explicitly consent to and understand all data access and operations. And users must retain control over what data is shared and what actions are taken. So, really, MCP server shouldn't be accessing, data that it shouldn't be accessing. So there's always human in the loop when we're designing MCP. All right, now let me switch gears and talk about Azure MCP Server in Visual Studio 2026. So at .NET Conference just a few weeks ago, we announced the GA release of Azure MCP Server in Visual Studio 2026, which you can use alongside GitHub Copilot to deploy and manage your Azure resources and do a bunch of different Azure operations. A cool thing about this particular release is that the Azure MCP Server is now built into the IDE, so there's no need for really any additional extra configurations. If you use the Azure MCP Server in conjunction with agent mode, Copilot doesn't just suggest code, but it actually becomes an active teammate that understands your Azure environment and helps you build, deploy, and manage your app end to end. With Azure MCP, you can bring in Azure resource context directly into GitHub Copilot. That means your resources, your configurations, and your environment, all of those will be accessible by the LLM, and it can give you smarter and more relevant suggestions. And you can also tap into Azure best practices. You can also generate Azure-related code, as well as infrastructure as code, which I'll be showing in my demo a little bit later on. All right, so with that, I think I can head on over to showing the first part of my demo, which is to build and deploy a .NET application. So let's get started. All right, so here I have my ASP.NET Core Razor Pages application on .NET 8, and it's called the Doggy Spa. This application is designed for managing a dog grooming business. and it handles like 2 core workflows. Let's actually build a project and run it locally so I can show you these functionalities. All right, so here's my app running locally. And you can see there are a few functionalities like creating an appointment. I'm going to put my name, Yoon-jung Choi, my pet's name, Coney, and then set the appointment time to the upcoming Friday. Okay, I'm going to create an appointment. And we can see immediately there is an appointment that's been created. You can also see it in the Appointments tab. And then I can also visit the Upload Photo tab, which is not fully functional because Azure Blob Storage is not configured just yet. All right, now that we've verified that our app is actually up and running locally, what we're going to do next is use GitHub Copilot. And for the entirety of this session, I'll be using agent mode. I prefer using agent mode because it's able to, autonomously handle tasks and, perform a lot of the commands on my behalf and make direct edits to my workspace and my files. Okay, for the model, I have Claude Sonnet 4.5, and I'm just going to make sure that I have all the Azure MCP server tools toggled on. You'll see there's like 48 of them. These are actually shown up in namespace mode. So there's a lot more commands associated with Azure MCP, but we've shrunk them down to namespaces mode because LLMs sometimes have a difficult time, finding tools when there's a huge number of tools. Okay, I'm going to ask, I want to deploy my app to Azure. What are some of the best options out there? Okay, right as I send this prompt, I can see that it knows that my application is the Razor Pages application. It's using ASP.NET Core, and it's giving me a long list of Azure resources to choose from, with Azure App Service being the top choice. Copilot is also sharing its reasoning around why Azure App Service is the top choice. It's mainly because it has the native ASP.NET Core support. There's also like seamless integration with Azure SQL and storage. And it's just, I would say, a more price-effective option to get started, especially for a small production workload like mine. All right, now that I've evaluated which resource I'm going to deploy my app to, I'm going to ask Copilot to provision an app service in my current selected subscription. I'm going to specify the region. You don't really have to do this, but I just like to do it because sometimes, you can have quota issues and whatnot. So I just want to make sure Copilot gets it right the first time. Okay, we can see that a tool was invoked to list my Azure subscription, to grab my Azure subscription information. All right, it indicated that I have access to multiple subscriptions, but it also understands that my current subscription context is my personal subscription, so it defaulted to that. And it's also asking my consent for running all of these tools from the Azure MCP server. I'm just gonna simply, allow all for now. Alrighty. Okay, we're starting to provision the app service, starting off by creating a resource group. Okay, looks like that's completed. Now it's moving on to the next step, which is to create an app service plan. And it's using the B1 SKU, the basic SKU, which I said is more suitable for like a smaller production workloads. Oh, it went into an issue. Yeah, there must be a parameter that was unnecessary, so it looks like it removed the parameter and ran it again. The nice thing about Copilot is it's able to iterate on its mistakes, and it's very persistent when it comes to getting its tests done. I would say it's probably way more persistent than I am. So you can see it keeps retrying until it gets it right. All right, looks like the app service was provisioned, and there's been a second attempt to create a web app. All right, there's some activity going on in the terminal indicating that, okay, the deployment was successful. And at the end of, there's a little bit of error, I would say, but I think based on the terminal output, I'm pretty sure the resources have been provisioned. So I'm just gonna ask Copilot. Okay, now Copilot is confirming that indeed my resources were successfully provisioned. It must be a transient issue in the chat that was not showing the chat responses, but the resources have been successfully deployed. All right, and now Copilot is giving me a nice summary of all the things that it did. Now that I have an app service up and running, I'm going to create a publish profile and publish my application to the newly provisioned resource. Okay, we can see that Copilot is querying Azure Resource Graph to gather some information about my resource. All right, it looks like it finally went through. Okay, based on the terminal output, I can see all the necessary details have been fetched. And the necessary information from my app service plans also been fetched. Now, the tool for creating Azure Website Publish Profile was run, and I can see that the Publish Profile has been created. I'm just going to move that out of the way. And now Copilot is running the Publish tool to actually publish the profile. Oh, looks like it ran into an issue. Copilot is validating the build error. The build is successful. This tells me that this is more likely like an initialization issue, and it usually resolves itself if you do a retry. Okay, Copilot is trying publishing again using Azure CLI. All right, and we're getting indications that the application has been built successfully, and it's now being deployed using zip deploy. All right. Okay, now Copilot is validating if the deployment is working. Yep, and then the deployment have succeeded. Great. And like before, Copilot also generates a nice summary of all the actions it took. All right, we're gonna get a application URL, so which means our app should be up and running on cloud now. So we're gonna copy and paste that into a browser tab. And we can see there our app is up and running. And it's now hosted on the app service that we just provisioned using Azure MCP and GitHub Copilot. And let's check the functionalities. and I'm able to create my appointment. Awesome. Now let's move on to the second part of the demo. Now that we have our application up and running, we'd like to add SQL and storage to it. But this time we're going to use infrastructure as code. This is going to be an interesting experience because I myself actually don't have any previous knowledge on infrastructure as code. So let's see what Copilot and Azure MCP can do for us. So I'm going to simply prompt Copilot to generate a bicep template for adding Azure SQL and storage. And I'm going to say do not generate any other artifacts like deployment scripts, because I know sometimes Copilot likes to get wild with creating these scripts. So I just want to avoid that. And I'm also going to nudge Copilot to use Azure best practices. We can see an ask to run Azure MCP servers, Azure best practices. I'm going to consent. Also, we're calling into Microsoft Doc Search, which actually is integrated into Azure MCP as well. All right, so Copilot is calling all of these tools to get more up-to-date information around bicep generation and Azure SQL database best practices. And I can see that the bicep files are being generated as we speak. All right. Okay, now we're getting a nice summary, again, indicating that our bicep files have been successfully created. They should be in the infra folder. And they are also following some of the security best practices. Okay, let's now validate if these files are actually there. So we're going to go to the Solution Explorer, change to the folder view, expand on the folder, and yeah, under infra, we have several bicep files, the main bicep and the bicep parameters, which is great. Yeah, I did not have to know a single thing about bicep to be able to author these bicep templates. Now, one thing I noticed though is that when Copilot was generating these bicep, it wasn't calling one of the Azure MCP tools for bicep schema. Sometimes that happens, so I nudged it to actually call into it, and then it was able to run additional validations on the bicep templates and made some additional changes as well to update the storage account API version to the latest one, and basically what you're seeing on the screen right here. All right, now that we have our bicep templates, we're going to deploy using the instructions that's shared in one of the summaries. All right, so Copilot is first verifying that if I have my Azure CLI installed, because that's what we're going to be using for the deployment. All right, it's checking whether I'm logged in, and I am logged in. It's grabbing my Entra ID, object ID, and the SQL Server admin configuration, filling out all the necessary details. All right, now the parameters file are being updated with some of the real values, like the actual values. We were able to just grab. All right, looks like we're hitting some sort of a warning because of the storage account name. Potentially it's too long. So there are some naming conventions changes that we're making. After that, the bicep template is being validated again. Okay, now we're moving on to creating the resource group. Okay, now we're doing an analysis to preview the changes before deploying. Yeah, this step is going to take a little while. Okay, it looks like we're hitting a policy error, but we don't need to worry. Copilot is very persistent, and it's going to iterate on the error. Okay, now we're doing one more what if validation. Looks like there's an error again. Okay, this one is to enable the Entra-only authentication at the server level. So some additional changes are being made to my bicep. One more check to validate the what if scenarios. All right, looks like it finally went through. Okay, so these are all the resources that will be provisioned. Okay, so we're hitting an issue because the East US region is actually restricted for my subscription. So what's going to happen next is the Copilot automatically chose a different region to deploy these resources to. So we're going to deploy to the West US region. We'll need to create another resource group and clean up the old ones. All right, so there's a slight like a naming conflict, so we're trying out a different name. All right, we're now deploying the new resource group. And right now I'm like showing you this demo, but you can actually have this just running kind of in the background as you're working on something else. So really, the autonomous nature of agent mode helps you, it helps improve your productivity because you can just, have this running and sort of just half pay attention to it. All right. Okay. Looks like the deployment was successful at last. Okay, it's showing the new resource group that it just provisioned in West US 2, and then also listing out all the resources that were captured in our bicep file as deployed. Great. No, now after this step, we're running a little bit out of time. So after this step, what I ended up doing was I just prompted the Copilot to update the app settings with the newly provisioned resources and also granted the app access to the SQL database. And we were able to get the app up and running. As you see in the screenshot, the connectivity status have been updated to be both green, and I was able to successfully create appointments. All the functionalities were working, and even the upload the pet photo page was working as expected. So with that, I just want to end by just nudging all of you to try out Azure MCP. It's really a must-have for Azure developers and also those who want to learn about Azure. It significantly reduces the learning curve about Azure development. It helps boost your productivity by giving LLM Azure context, and it helps you tap into some of the Azure best practices so you can build something that is production ready. So here are some of the resources I want to share with you today. The Get Started link will take you to how to get started on VS 2026 with Azure MCP. The blog link will take you to our recent GA announcement, and the repo link will take you to the Azure MCP All-Up repo, which will have multiple instructions on how to get Azure MCP set up in different IDEs. So with that, that's the end of my session. Thank you so much for watching.